historian, and author whose work brings visibility to the overlooked stories of queer life in the South. His critically acclaimed book, A Night at the Sweet Gumhead, Drag, Drugs, Disco, and Atlanta's Gay Revolution, dives deep into Atlanta's 1970s drag scene and the political battles surrounding it. Martin is a former Knight Wallace Fellow and a Lambda Literary Fellow, and he holds an MFA in Narrative Nonfiction from the University of Georgia. Martin's latest book, The Mini Passion, Michael Hardwick, explores the lives affected by the Supreme Court's 1986 Bowers versus Hardwick decision, a case rooted in Atlanta that helped lay the groundwork for Lawrence versus Texas and ultimately marriage equality. It was published just this last June, and I'm sure he's going to talk a little more about the book later, right?
A little bit.
Okay, or give a plug for it.
What about you?
Yeah. Joining Martin is the remarkable Abby Drue. I'm sure we all remember Abby, right? Woo! Yeah.
Oh, please.
Abby Drue is an activist, organizer, and self-described social justice visionary and empathic schemer.
I didn't write
the
that.
last known survivor.
But you didn't deny it either.
I didn't deny it.
Abby is the last known survivor of the 1969 Lonesome Cowboys raid. Her courage and memory are living links to the pivotal moment in Atlanta's queer history. Abby has spent her life in quiet activism and community service. She has worked on campaigns for the LGBTQ plus rights, anti-poverty initiatives, and racial justice. And today, she serves as the executive director and CEO of the Ben Marion Institute of Social Justice, where she continues to inspire new generations to take up the work of liberation. Their stories, their insights, their lived experiences will help us root today's conversations in the past and look forward with purpose and clarity. Please join us in welcoming both of them, and I will turn it over to them.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Is this good volume?
Good morning, fun seekers.
Abby and I were just catching up. We spoke 4 or 5 years ago while I was working on the
That's
Sweet
right.
Gumhead, and had a great conversation, and then realized we were neighbors, that we lived a block apart, and it's so great to reconnect with you again. I miss Atlanta as a full-time resident, but it's still my hometown, so thank you all for welcoming me back. More importantly, thanks for showing up for an event like this. It is critical that right now we spend time realizing the community around us. The in-person events are so powerful, and there's such a temptation to let our social and our political lives exist online. And we have to fight that first before we can fight anything else. So, thank you. Abby, we were just talking about Ben Marion Institute and the work, the valuable work that you've done throughout your life. But if you could, maybe because I'm less familiar with that work, let's start there. Tell me about what your day-to-day existence as a not-so-quiet activist is about.
My day-to-day existence. First of all, it's praising God every day I'm upright.
Amen.
Amen.
Yes.
That's correct. The Ben Marion Institute is a culmination for me of a lifetime of learning that keeps continuing in understanding what makes us tick, what makes us feel like we're enough, what makes us feel like we're not enough. The Ben Marion Institute, and I will share this with you because I feel so fortunate. Ben and Marion were my mother and father. People have asked me about this. Ben and Marion, in their own life, were quiet people, but had a keen sense of what was fair. And I was brought up in a home like that, where I got to experience all kinds of folks. All kinds of folks. Short, tall, kind of characters, some strange. Well, I was 4. A lot is strange when you're 4, when you're first seeing a lot. Our home was filled with all kinds of folks, from political people to our neighbors, Al and Arthur upstairs who raised French poodles, to women next door. Everyone, was included. Many, many years later, they became, I know they didn't even expect this, to be one of the test cases with Martin Luther King, the Supreme Court, that opened up hotels and restaurants, the beginning steps in the South, to blacks and Jews. What an incredible relationship, what a fragile relationship, quote, than blacks and Jews had. And I was raised in that. I was one of the early 9 of us that were chosen to be VISTA volunteers in a very different time, in the mid-60s, when integration was applauded and was going to be happening. And they knew, our government knew, that there would be a school, a city, whatever, that would maybe say graciously abide by integration, but once inside, those wonderful children would be invisible. I think that was a key time for me, really, the spirit of one day I would have my own institute. I didn't realize I would wait till I was 60, but I was busy. But my job in VISTA, and where I began to see the differences, that made me curious of how people react in their fear. And it became a whole beginning journey for me in wanting to stay curious about how we behave and how we engage others. Long-winded answer for you. But Ben Marion is alive and well. I'm a quiet doer. There are those on the streets. I had to give up a lot of things by becoming a federal 501c3 and to be fragilely careful in where I stepped. It was very hard not to even, know that I would be scrutinized through many administrations. Ben Marion is almost going to be 25 years. And I'm giving a plug. I'm not asking for a thing other than we engage nationally in places and situations where quietly they can begin to be good critical thinking. And I'll talk more about that.
Let me take you back to your family. I love this personal connection to the story of realizing that equity was something that you were being steeped in from a very young age. You talked about the distinctions between quiet activism and public activism, but I'm really curious about how queer activism plays into that. When did you realize that you might be queer and that there was a place and a context in Atlanta, and how would you describe that? What was it like being queer in Atlanta when you realized that you were part of our community?
Being queer, and first of all, I've been asked many times, when did you come out? I never was in. Let me explain to you something. In my family, the messages were given to be curious and to understand whoever you might be. The important thing was to be happy. I remember my parents saying to me, Abby, when your outside shows what's inside, you are genuinely happy. You will be able to do whatever you want. But more important, Abby, when that is happening, and when people are able to have on the outside what they feel on the inside, they tend to leave other people alone and aren't mean. Okay? That was a beginning when I was very young. And that happened when I realized that there was something that made me curious, because I was a young person who moved to an area with my parents that had restrictions to blacks and Jews in Florida. It was Palm Beach, Florida. My family went back there, the immediate family, were the only ones there as Jewish people that were allowed, or even to own property. It was unusual, and you're saying, how can that be? How can that be? Well, when I was a little girl, I couldn't go in certain drugstores. I couldn't go in hotels. I couldn't go in certain restaurants. My parents were New Yorkers. I grew up part of my life in New York, young life, till there was a move in my family decided by my father that there needed to be a change in his occupation. So we went and joined an uncle who had come down in the turn of the last century to that area and had brought farm and food and all kinds of things. My family had farms in upstate New York as well, cherry orchards, Long Island duckling, and these were things that needed to come through on the train with a man named Flagler. My father went to work for my uncle when we moved down there, and little did I know what I would be presented with as a street kid in New York was going to be totally different in Palm Beach, Florida. Totally different. I don't know if any of you are Floridians here. Ah, where?
Jacksonville.
Okay, they have their story. You too. For me, what it was, I wound up the first day, at barely 9 years of age. I was put in the 4th grade and sat down, and we wore Bermuda shorts, and we had, you know, it was very different. It was very different. But I was a city kid, and I knew I could endure. Not because I was a city kid, but because I had parents who told me I was enough. They needed to feel enough too for what they went into. The minute I got in the class, what happened? And this all goes into where I am today. Little boy next to me named Robert Christie said, "So, Abby, how much money do your folks have? And what's your religion?" Well, in Palm Beach, you were either white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or Catholic. There was nothing else. And I said, "Oh, I'm Jewish." And he looked at me and went, "You're a Jew?" And he said, "Hey everybody, she's a Jew." And he got up and they moved their desks away from me.
Oh.
Oh, don't worry, I was plotting how to beat the shit out of them. So how did you before? In a gentle way. I knew I was in over my head, and I was barely 4 feet tall. I was small. And I said, "This is not good." And then, on top of that, and the teacher's back in her corner in the desk, oblivious. Another reason we have to look at education and where it is today. And then we get ready to pledge the flag. So now I'm just digesting this situation, and we're going to pledge the American flag. And I said, "I know that, you know. We know it became under God while I was still in New York. You know, Pledge Allegiance once didn't have under God." And yes, we older ones are all nodding. So then the teacher, Miss Whitehouse, gets up in the front and stands in front of everybody and pledges the flag. And I look around in 1954, and everyone else pledging the flag were doing the Nazi salute.
Oh.
What? Yeah. This is true. And remember, it wasn't that far. I had experienced it first as a child in a school in New York, a public school, PS 77, the same school my parents went to. It was the first place that there was the Nazi rally. Norman Lincoln Rockwell. Much happened in our history. And my parents began to say, we need to understand history, even from our own family standpoint. But what happened from that point on was a continuing understanding of my parents' nature of how you deal with that. And I went home and they said, "Abby, how'd you do with school?" And I went, "Oh." Because I was no way gonna have them come to the school, no way. My oldest sister though had a terrible time, 14, the same school, it was horrible for her. And I still to this day, we talk about it, we've come a long way. And I said, it was all right, as I'm still plotting what I'm gonna do to that Robert Christie. She said, well, I know you probably had a little time. When you go back tomorrow, you tell them when they get to know you, they'll like you. My mother, she was right, in one sense. How we do that today, I learned, evolves. It's not so much when you get to know me, but it's also a mutual thing of when I get to know you and you get to know me, maybe we'll like one another. The things I learned from that is that nobody should ever be just invisible. The children I told you in Vista that I took to school, we knew that they'd be put in the back of the classroom and ignored. Yes, they were integrated. What a price, but it did lead on to what I do today, and I could go on and on with that, but let's keep going.
Well, I want to pick up on what you just said about visibility, because that's the hallmark of queer history, that we were invisible, and even when you were beginning to participate in events with other queer people, we still weren't visible. There would be events that happened that would be covered in like a Compton's cafeteria, which there's no legible history of what actually happened there. And actually, if I can put in a plug for that, there's a book out the same day as my latest one. Eric Piepenberg wrote Dining Out, and he deconstructs the Compton's Cafeteria episode and talks to the owners of the place and reasons with them that we really don't have evidence of what happened. That people believe that it happened, but it has been created as a historical moment. I'm really fascinated with that because Stonewall is a historical moment, but it wasn't a national media event, so you don't necessarily have a perception of it. When you're queer in Atlanta, how are you finding other people to form community with? And is there a sense that people are aware of it?
The Atlanta I experienced when I came here, first in the mid-60s. I dropped out of school and came here to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And it was life-changing in the work I had done here. I had first began to be able to explore who I was. I never had an issue one way or the other. I knew I certainly enjoyed women. I knew that whoever I was comfortable, and I was very comfortable because of my folks navigating through gay and straight people in Atlanta. Atlanta in the mid-60s was a very, I hate the word, but segregated for gay folks, for queers, as opposed, it had a hierarchy. Atlanta's visibility, and when you say invisible, it relied on people being out and being able to be comfortable with themselves. That did not exist at all in this city as a whole for a gay community, nor did it in the 70s. And I dare say the 80s, because in a lot of ways, and what prompted me more and more was the work that then I could begin to understand about personal power when you have positional power, i.e. I worked under 3 mayoral systems. I first started in the early 70s and went through looking at our community and how in some ways, yes, we needed to speak out. We need both. In the 60s, it just was a way of navigating. If you came here and you didn't know how to meet people, you relied on one system, the yellow cabs. All yellow cabs knew where the gay bars were. And that's true in other cities too, in the South particularly. In the North, you could read a paper and find out you're going directory. But here, the places that encouraged it also were places that weren't easy and they sometimes dangerous in grouping. It was a very difficult, unspoken situation. And into the 70s, when we had the raid, that alone was the straw that broke the camel's back, because so many times before that, in years before, there was just so many incidents of brutal police brutality. There was, if you walked in what was then Midtown area, which was considered very, very queer, if you were walking down the street, chances are you would get beaten. There were fraternities whose hazing or introduction into fraternity would be to go out and find a queer and beat the shit out of them, or chité, if you're French. Je ne sais pas. We can laugh, but I knew once I was in the city what was happening. There was horrible things happening also because to be in the closet, so what was going on, I began to be very curious about what shame-based behavior was about. And we really qualified. We many times shot ourselves in our own foot in how we dealt with our discomfort and our lack of being acknowledged, our lack of feeling enough. And I thought, okay, if you have personal power and you have a position, maybe both can be used in a way that begins to ask good questions. And I came from a family that knew how to ask good questions. The gay community in the 60s and all were under a lot of assumption. This is my opinion. They assumed a lot because when you're frightened, what else can you do? You know there might be the other side of it, but if we're enough, maybe we can talk about the value of that kind of treatment. And that's what I decided to do within City Hall, quietly.
Let me ask you real quickly about that set of assumptions, because I'm curious, in the late 60s in Atlanta, what did people feel like they had as, you know, as their selves as a queer or as part of a community that was starting to organize, and what did they want?
What they had were enough people, first of all, who found their voice. When the raid happened, and the immediate getting together and glumming and talking about what would be and what we could do, began to make people more visible. It was a start. It was going to be a long finish, which still hasn't happened. What we realized by the number, that raid, everyone there, the way it was handled and all was not like the first time. There were so many raids on so many of the clubs, constantly. And it was a way of pushing in. That era made people realize we had to group quietly, but it forced everyone to be more quiet. So when this finally happened, that was it. That was enough. And they began to organize, and it was a small group, and safety in numbers. Sometimes when you're with some colleagues and friends and you're going out and you're sitting in a straight place and you're all queer and all, you still have your camaraderie, you're comfortable. Today it's much easier, of course. I hope that answers some of it. Say some more.
It does. This moment before the Lonesome Cowboys evening, I recall one incident that I read a couple stories about was a Halloween party where a lot of people were dressed in, I guess, what you could consider drag, but it's Halloween, so it's a costume also, and 100 people were thrown into paddy wagons. So these episodes of harassment by police were starting to be debated in newspapers also. So there's this contemporary movement in law and in the people who were affected by it to dial up the wick. Pressure was building.
Yeah, and where this came, here's the piece that I think is very important to understand, or it was for me, and I share it with you. In the 60s, you look at who is elected officials. Ivan Allen. Ivan Allen was the most layered person in a good way. Ivan Allen was elected. He came from a very privileged family. He served 2 terms. When the raid happened, it was Ivan Allen who was mayor. He was a raunch, just such a strict segregationist early on when he ran for mayor, and even when he first ran for governor, and he lost to another man who was even a worse segregationist. But Ivan had a change of heart. So here we get into the thing about, I'm going to throw out assume goodwill. Don't be assuming not. He changed his tune a lot, but Ivan was very dedicated to making this city become enormously growing, large. It grew 30%. And then Ivan looked, and when he got elected, he looked at the population. Well, guess what? In his first election as mayor, the population of Atlanta was almost nearing 50% black. Well, he ran for mayor. Do you know who he ran against? Lester Maddox. Okay. Well, there's your ultimate. Well, he won. He was supported and got elected mayor by the black community. That alone showed me about how we need to become more visible, how we need to begin to remind folks that we exist and we have a population and we have a voting population. And that if we're enough and we have enough pride in ourselves, then possibly we can learn to have voice and discuss it. And it was very, very, it's very new. We're learning by the seat of our pants how to do this. Ivan, he knew about this situation, but he knew the first thing that had to happen was there had to be some racial calm for a city to grow. He wanted the city to grow. I think something like 9 or 10 of the major tall buildings in the city were beginning construction during his time he was mayor. He also went ahead and appointed the first black firefighters, police department. And the first day of his administration, and I'm gonna get to why this isn't about gay, he made a mandate that all the water fountains, all the signs, everything in Atlanta, the word colored had to be taken off.
Huh.
I don't know if you all are aware of that, but he did it. And he did it also basing on legislation my parents were involved in, and that were in Washington and under Kennedy. So, what happened, this is Robert Kennedy, was then, what was beginning to ease up was also beginning to look at what is going on in this community. And when I moved here permanently, I really wanted to look at what was gonna be the situation, even politically. We need to always understand what makes those in office tick and look for underlying meaning, which we had to learn to do and are still learning how to do. To communicate and ask good questions. It's one thing to tell people what you need to do. When someone tells me, and even as a little kid, you need to, we've got to stop ourselves. We just do. So slowly, behind City Hall doors, there were conversations, and there was the place where I felt I could do something that makes sense. When something makes sense to you, you're more comfortable and you usually do it, right? So, my main person was Maynard. And Maynard and I had lots of conversations. It was no secret I was an out lesbian. But how you are comfortable with yourself, I learned, dictates an awful lot of how people are comfortable about you. It's not easy. It's not easy. And that piece into the 70s, with Maynard, there was an awful lot of good things that happened. And behind closed doors, I am not responsible, but I certainly, let's say, was there asking good questions when we decided that there would become a proclamation to make a gay day, Pride Day in Atlanta. That doesn't happen it happens from being down, sitting down and asking, what is the value of what is happening here? What is the history? The city is ripe for so much. I was the cultural arts director, consultant in developing more theater, more music, more everything, art centers. And this city had so much wonderful, gay creativity and sparkle and genius that was not being really allowed or given the right venue to begin to be mainstream. And through the 60s and 70s still, there was an awful lot of horrible things being done in our community. In the 70s, Meadmont Park, and these are the things that being in City Hall, we could address behind closed doors. It was called the knee walks. You know what the knee walks were? Nobody here. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm really glad. The knee walks were where gay men would go. I know. In Piedmont Park, the last of the forest to the left of the Botanical Center, where sadly they would go for rendezvous for men who were on the down low, who were married. But the sad part about it, and we knew and it wasn't talked about, there are those who knew, and then in the Botanical Gardens when that was created, there were people who knew, now unfortunately gone. There were body bags being taken out weekly, maybe 4 a week. Queer, wonderful men. We just weren't enough. Where were we going to be connected? The bars were also manipulated terribly.
And if you felt comfortable being out in a bar where sometimes police officers were taking pictures of people going in and out of them and were being surveilled. It's so important that you talk about this as a spectrum of events happening over time. This, we've always been here. It's the gradual process of visibility that led through organizations developing, like Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine, and then to events that precipitate activism.
Well, what happened here with all of that wonderful stuff was that, number one, the things that were going to begin to happen had to happen in conversation,
Right.
as well as on the streets. The piece for me that we began to realize, those of us who could, that there had to become some organized way to look at public officials, some organized way to look at what was happening in the bars who were being manipulated by so many different industries that were, the tobacco industry was just ruthless there. But we began by forming ACRE, the Atlanta, ACRE, I gotta get my acronym right. There were 8 of us, and there was myself, and the rest were 7 men who decided we would begin to form an action pack. Atlanta needed to have us to interview the first candidates running for all kinds of office in Atlanta. ACRE became Gay Pack, and then we changed the name again when HRC came in because we needed to continue, became Georgia Equality. And along with that, I worked a lot in the women's community to begin, because everyone mostly was in the closet. There was a comfort level to a point. But then I created a thing called Fourth Tuesday, which was a networking organization that went on from a small group of women that were meeting privately that didn't want to go on and do that public thing. One of them, who was my partner at the time, and said, you can take it on if you want to make it a public thing. And my goal was then to integrate it also with the Black community. I had come here as a professor. I was a professor at Morehouse Spelman, what was called AU University. And the types of integrating that needed to happen, I failed terribly. The Black community wasn't ready. The Black community of Ivan Allen, even when we were talking back then, were not ready, and he relied on that community. And I learned little steps, maybe it'll begin to happen. But
I want to throw out another book recommendation that kind of details this process where Atlanta's power structure finally engaged the Black community. It's a book called White Flight by Kevin Cruz, and it describes the mechanisms how the official work to desegregate the city was met with this vivid counter-resegregation movement of white people who decided that they weren't going to have any part of this and found ways to do it through real estate, through law, and through pulling themselves out of common society. And I feel that it's really important because so many lessons of the queer civil rights movement were directly inspired by or just borrowed from the civil rights movement. The March on Washington in 1987, the direct predecessor was, of course, the March on Washington in 1963. And so many of those lessons carry over. As somebody who has participated on like all different kinds of actions, how do they differ? What do you think became most effective as this event translated into a real queer rights movement in Atlanta?
I think what became effective was that there were more what I call comfort zones that were created for those who were not out. There was a great pressure, everybody come out, come out. No. The majority of the white flight folks, children, were gay too. I mean, elite kinds of situations, the pressure, the agony of not being able to be authentically yourself turned inward into a lot of behavior. So we had a job first to do by developing different kinds of programs, and I created one called Internalized Homophobia. And it was then sponsored, we made it sponsored, that was the beginning of Georgia Equality. I traveled the state going where we could get more people who would come, and the churches who agreed would bring gay men and women in, and they were all in a closet. I'd go to all kinds of places, Columbus. Everybody was coming into the Mecca of Atlanta, but there were people living in all these places married, whatever, and they would run into the church, making sure nobody saw them. And, you know, they wore hats down, and we began to realize that at that point, we could begin to talk about a very slow process, and that's more my type of activism. And I think overall, it began to make a generation that learned how to find their voice, just like my sisters and brothers in the Black community who were gay and not gay, began to find your voice. The areas, it took a lot of talking, Coretta Scott King, it took a lot in the churches, both white and Black, to begin to make more comfortable situations for queer people to feel that they're enough. For myself personally, at my table, the seats of a Jewish congregation Bet Havarim, were created. Because I wanted those who also were mixed marriages, everything. And now today, that anyone is welcome. And churches soon started to behave that way too. Not everybody. But for me, the most important value is not changing the world, but to just be present in it, to do what I can that makes sense to me. I'm not gonna change the world. But at the same time, my whole thing is about our own behavior. We can be on the streets screaming, but the ability, and something that I brought to the table early and learned how to do to create more community, was to talk about ways you speak to really be heard. It's one thing to speak out and shout, it's another if anyone's gonna listen. So we have to ask good questions, and I find it at that point today, that we are at the pinnacle of how to ask good questions, mixed in. I mean, can you imagine? I delight in seeing our marches, going downtown, whatever, and seeing everybody, every flag, everything. It never would have been long ago. Our first march, we were on the sidewalk. We had to stop for the red lights and wait for the light to turn green to go.
1971.
Yeah. What?
Hey, Marty.
Amen. We would
Just saw
have.
me around the corner of my mind, sorry.
Yeah.
Let's turn home there.
God forbid we should do anything wrong.
That makes me think very specifically about, you're talking about history, we read the tea leaves, we see an event happen, then you follow through and how progress is made, and then some other important event happens, and we're trying to put together a story that our head can comprehend. For you very specifically, the Lonesome Cowboys raid happens. You begin to work with the mayor, and then Ivan Allen appoints the first gay person to the Community Relations Commission. And Maynard Jackson continues and appoints another, and then Maynard Jackson agrees to name official Gay Pride Day. Concrete progress, intermittent with sometimes static to mildly improving or mildly degrading circumstances. And big events punctuate that. You saw that progress. How did you take advantage of it while it was happening in real time? Did you just go knock on Maynard Jackson's door and say, "Hi, I want to talk to you"?
Hey, Maynard.
Well, Maynard and I, first of all, let's back up one thing.
Yeah.
I came here right before the mayors to the Rockefeller Foundation to begin to look at equity, and I became a professor for a year at AU, at Morehouse, Spelman, whatever. And so that was another whole tie-in with Maynard, his family, all kinds of things. I didn't expect, I was planning not to stay more than a year. I never left. I was here in the mid-60s. I'd come every year from the time I was here in 1965. But I also lived in Chicago. I was in the arts, teaching, University of Illinois, back and forth, Chicago Art Institute. And then I'd come here all the time, half my life in Atlanta, because I loved it and I had my friends here who supported who I was as a lesbian. And they were straight folks. We'd all go to different bars and whatever. So the thing, to me, how I took advantage of Maynard was not knocking on his door, but we kind of just, he just said, "Are you free now? Can we talk?" We talked a lot. He was vice mayor, you know, under Michelle. Michelle's the one who actually hired me.
Oh, yeah, no, incorrect, it was not an Ellen who named this.
No, it wasn't. I was
It's
gonna,
Miss
I was
Elsa.
gonna,
Sorry,
I was,
yeah.
that was okay. They were all in the pile together, you know, and it was fine, but Michelle, he was, for me, decent, and, hired me, and then, when it became Maynard's turn, I took advantage by helping with Shirley Franklin, developing his 2 campaigns. We did a second campaign in Sid and Marty Croft. I can't, do you know that place?
Oh,
There's joy in being playful, people. Our community needs to be as playful as we can in a loving way, not a sarcastic way. That's a message that's important in how I took advantage, again, of personal power and positional power to just ask, what's the value? Let's get real here. In a city that has such a population, and I set out to really increase the vote with a nice group of incredibly hardworking men, all of whom are not alive right now because they died of AIDS. And we'd go in the bars and we would register people like crazy. No one was registered in the 70s, and the women's community needed to step up. And that was part of what I felt I could help with in developing things that were more open in the city, in the arts, for queer people to come to. And we would have all kinds of events, and you know, it got to be, I know, that people would come here who were gay and would say, and the women would say, if you're, you know, if you want to know if somebody is gay that you're talking to, ask them if they know Abby Drue. That's the silliest thing. If I lived up to half my fantasy, I'd be dead. Their fantasies,
So it doesn't.
right?
So it doesn't seem like that, I mean, at least for me, it doesn't seem like that time is so far ago, but we seem so distant from a kind of power that is hostile to us right now. And luckily, we still are in a place where there's a mutual respect among, you know, city level, maybe even county level power, but how can we take the lessons that you've learned and apply it now to an environment where we're losing rights, where rights are being retracted, not recognized, where it seems as difficult as it's been in many people's lifetimes?
By the same simple steps that it always was. For now, I don't think we're that far from the hatred that was a long time ago. I feel that there are people so frightened. So for looking at underlying meaning, we need to definitely, in the rhetoric, in the things we talk about, how we engage, we have to ask more questions, but we also have to be honest with ourselves that we want to hear what they have to say and understand better. That's critical thinking, and I don't think that totally exists in the gay community right now in Atlanta. I can't speak otherwise because now I'm planted here and I'm glad I'm here. But I think overall, I'm looking at focus, what's happening here, because I think we can be a pivotal place, just like we were when it was the raid. The potential is here, and yes, it is easy to be out, but the truth of the matter is shame-based behavior is larger than ever. Alcoholism, the highest incident of alcoholism is GLBT. The highest incident of smoking is GLBT still. I worked 20 years in tobacco cessation as well, and worked with American Cancer Society, the AMA, and talking about the terrible preying on the gay community by tobacco, by everything, playing into shame-based behavior. We can't shoot ourselves in the foot by telling other people all the things that they are stupid and don't know what they're doing without asking them, what are you afraid of? What is the value for you personally? And it's beginning to happen. So if I could say a solution to what we need to be doing now, I do believe we need to be more actively listening and understanding who these hateful folks are. They are so frightened. And in that, you know, dangerous people do dangerous things, you know, and it's as simple as that. And they're dangerous because they are cognitively gone down to a lower level of behavior. We're lower, maybe 6-7-year-olds cognitively. I cared enough to understand how we think and work when we're afraid that I did go back to school in cognitive behavioral development from the arts to that. And I use that in the Ben Marion Institute to really look at who am I. It's a lifetime of learning about what we're comfortable with. I still go to the airport and someone has Georgia Voice or something and I see them get on a plane and they have folded it so no one will see that it is. That doesn't happen as often now, but it still does. I'm not trying to paint a gloomy picture here, but realistically, we've got to go know ourselves individually better, and we have to understand truly what's important. I took the time and still am taking the time to learn. I have been on different continents. I spent time with in Africa, Lavenda, in Asia, in Nepal, to absolutely learn what the heck makes people tick. And as I was doing that, the most important thing is I want to know what makes me tick. What are my triggers? Our community has every right to have triggers. But unless we engage them with a gentleness about forgiving ourselves, we have a right to get angry. I'm not saying we shouldn't get angry. But what we have for us is a right to also have positional power, personal power, that we make into positional power. And it's how you speak to people, so they'll hear you, and how you speak without attacking, and that's not easy. So every once in a while you have to go and kick somebody's ass. Just a little bit. Okay?
Thank you for that answer. I think it's really important for us to realize there are practical things that we can do and that we don't have to feel like all is lost when some is lost. And
Right.
we're lucky to understand the concept of a sanctuary city that is a sanctuary for queer people. We happen to live in one. And to reinforce those places while we attempt to change hearts and minds elsewhere, or recognize basic rights that are ours and that should not be taken away at the same time. I think it's critically important. I wanted to save time for your questions, because Abby and I've asked her a million questions. She's been nice enough over the past few years to answer a lot of them, but yours, so I'm gonna do a little Donahue here.
And I'm sorry, I don't want to talk, I'm sorry.
Dave.
Oh, thanks. Okay, I'm not sure that some of this was covered, but we were talking about the very first Pride in 1971. And what we love to say is the city too busy to hate, the great Chamber of Commerce refused to grant a permit for the march. So they did have to march on the
That's
stoplights
right.
and stop for every traffic light. Yeah, and there's actually a video from WSB that they have of it. And then did we talk about Charlie St. John, who was, because I wanted to mention him just momentarily. So we organized the 1972 Pride, and we had March the Streets, got a permit. And he was named, as you said, by Mayor Sam Cassell to be on the Community Relations Commission. So the first openly gay political appointee in early 1973. And then his apartment was raided by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And they claimed that he was a drug dealer. And it was very ironic because he was totally against drugs. But the apartment, I think it was like August of 1973, something like that. And he was evicted, he and his lesbian roommate. And so,
Yes,
and
I knew it.
penalties that, people had to go through. And then I also want to make sure we mention Winston Johnson, who got Coretta Scott King involved in LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, I
He
touched a
and,
little bit.
Her, what was her, aide, Lynn Cothran, yeah, they really.
Lynn Cothran.
They really got Mrs. King actively involved, so very too much information.
I appreciate it, Dave, that piece. Let me explain to you that there is gonna be little steps forward and little ones back. And it challenges everyone. When there was the raid in Hinson McAuliffe, Ivan Allen was trying to do everything right, but at the same time, he measured what was more important. Well, I think he mismeasured. And then later on, with these raids, the other piece for me that I don't mind saying now was the bars were, it was a set schedule for raiding them, hoping to find things. And what I was able to do, and I share with you about our personal power, is to say, can we compromise? That's the word that doesn't always come up. And the compromise was that maybe someone would whisper in my ear when a bar was going to be raided, and maybe then I would go to the bar and tell them. And that cut in half many of the arrests in the raids. Prepared, no drugs on you. But that didn't matter too, because you could still all of a sudden they say, hey, this was on you.
Right.
We still persist. We didn't get the permit to march. There are those who say, well, the hell with that, the gotcha. Then we will, we'll take our marbles and go home, we'll do something, we'll act out in the park, we'll kick a squirrel. However, well, we've eaten our own as queer folk, we've eaten our own and spit them out. But what we did instead was we marched, didn't we? So we stopped at every traffic light, it's kind of fun. But we marched.
Another question?
I was gonna mention, you mentioned Eric Peppenberg and Dining Out. He's gonna be doing a book signing September 4th, with Karis Books and Wars and Georgia LGBTQ History Project at Wolf's.
Of course,
So,
yes.
well,
Right, and it's the weekend of NLGGA coming.
yeah, the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association, which would be a block away from Blake's, which would have been better, but, the co-presenter works at Wolf, so she's presenting there. But I wanted to ask Abby, I know when Maynard did the gay proclamation back in the day, there was a lot of pushback, and I think there was even advertisements in newspapers.
We discussed it, and when it was going to happen, and this is where I'm eternally grateful to him. It was not a surprise, everything, was gonna happen, but it happened, so.
Was there a lot of ramifications because of that?
I think for a couple of weeks, Maynard was very uncomfortable. I felt badly too. There were, but we knew that sometimes there's a word that has been forgotten, and he remembered it too in his own life, and it's called courage. So simple. It took a hell of a lot of courage to do what he did. I can get teary-eyed today, because I was there when it was,
It was very hard back then.
it was very hard, but it worked. It worked, because sometimes the things that we worry about, we don't speak up because we already know what somebody's gonna react and think. We don't speak up when we wanna say to our folks, I'm queer, because we're afraid we're gonna be thrown out. There are always solutions. It's like, I was given the moniker, when these things came out, I know her, but I was always told to put, here, trouble solution. Here, trouble's in the hall, but she has a solution. No, we all have a solution. And it's a difficult, kind of thing.
What did you do under the administrations, or what brought you to politics?
What brought me to politics? I never got into politics. What brought me to was the source of where I made sense that maybe I did have an understanding of something that could be done differently. Politics started, if you want to know politics the way it was politics, our federal government, remember Vietnam. I was a young professor. I worked with Eartha Kitt against the war.
She's from my hometown. She's from my hometown.
She is?
Yeah.
Which side of your hometown?
North. It was actually called North South Carolina, but it's in Orangeburg.
Well, I meant in your town. Was she on the black side? Never mind. Yeah.
Which
By
side
the
of
way,
tracks?
Ivan Allen put up a fence between the black and the white communities after he did an awful lot of good things. And that was a big piece of history that should be talked about too here. Really, literally a fence.
I have another question up here.
First off, thank you so much for being here last night and today.
Yeah.
My question is, do you find that there's enough people stepping up right now? Or do you find that there are barriers that have been put up in the recent years that may hinder people from stepping up, especially the youth in the community?
I appreciate you saying that because it's the youth that I right now feel very, very, have a lot on my heart about this. Because I think it's pushing people back, and especially including trans, back into the closet as young people. I'm very involved in that. I was involved in it in the 70s with Georgia Mental Health was the place you went if you were going to do, get into trans and have a, transition. The things that are happening right now, I think that there aren't enough people, yes, there aren't enough ways of knowing how to speak up. There are people speaking up. There are also people in our community who I think in many ways forget you have to have two parts. You have to speak up, you have to shout, and if you do use that word, you need to change this. I'm not saying we don't need that. We need to talk about what's wrong, but there are many ways to do it. I do a lot of it on Facebook, just pointing out illogic. But we need to listen more and ask people more how they first got those ideas. Where did you first decide that was important? Another area that's very important in the Ben Marion is in libraries and children's book censorship. A lot, when I say quiet activist, I think there's always, you try to do what you're best at. And for me, I rather, at this point in my life, continue to practice asking good questions, gently being a negotiator. And taking my anger and really looking at why I'm at, where it's come from. It's in us so deep it doesn't leave. It's called neural pathways. They stick with us all our life, just like my hips. What are you gonna do?
We have another question here, and an ACT UP t-shirt, so priority.
Yes, I saw that t-shirt.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your stuff.
I hope this isn't overwhelming, and I hope, okay.
It's wonderful. I am retired clergy and new to Atlanta. So I'm wondering about your assessment or thoughts about the relationship between Pride and the larger faith community, where things stand now. Who are you seeing that really gets resistance and makes that part of their work? I mean, just your comments about that relationship.
Well, I think it's a lot healthier place in terms of the ecumenical community here than years and years ago. But once Pride became really a march, there was a lot jumping in right on the street, water, whatever, St. Mark's. There were identified places, and there always will be. Change is slow, but for those who begin to want to examine their behavior, I think we're healthier than a lot of other places in the South. From different, sects of religion and I can't, I don't want to totally comment because I don't have enough information. But I know the ones that have been supportive and very much involved in all that I've done. The Episcopal Church, I've worked nationally with them in the issues of internalized homophobia in the church. Those are one of them. Was that where you from?
I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church, yeah. So
Oh.
we have a lot to
Tell
talk
me
about.
your name, please.
I'm Sally Johnston.
Sally. I'm Abby. Hi. Can we talk? Okay. I hope that answers it. I do think that is one. And going to churches and being, if you're enough to be in them and be visible of who you are. I think we have somebody.
We have a couple down here.
Okay.
Hi, Abby.
Hey, Kara.
I'm going to try to get to a question, but I did want to take on what you were saying about the youth and being concerned for them and wanting them to not have to go backwards. And I have an 18-year-old, and he's now questioning his sexuality, as are pretty much all the friends and students and peers that he has at his school. And I think that what we're facing right now is a backlash against this movement, this natural movement for the youth to engage their questions about sexuality, from the trans community to, just as they're becoming sexual beings, to be thinking about, how do I want to define myself, or do I want to define myself? I think that the youth culture around gender has busted open a lot of people's ways of thinking, to the point where that's where the fear comes from, right? They're afraid of this movement that's becoming more general among a youth population. So here's the question to me is, how do we engage the youth in wanting to step up to the table to make this a movement for their generation? I mean, your generation was primed to resist and have the support of the music industry, of revolution, that it was a cultural movement. And so I feel like the youth are there doing it on their own, and that's why they're occupied. They're not occupied in creating a movement to educate or change hearts and minds. They're involved in their own development. But is there a way to harness that energy? I guess that's the question I have for you.
Yes. It would be contradictory if I said, maybe. I think there is, of course. One of the motivations of my Ben Marion Institute when I decided to go ahead and do it, was to engage in the schools, particularly all over, beginning to look at, and this is what is more important, is looking at who is leading the curriculums, everything in the school system. Goes back to your school boards. I mean, this is very real, because I've had to deal with them, city councils, but the schools themselves, when we see parents, and I have been brought in on this, and I won't name the schools, where parents who don't even have children in the school have come in as a little group into the library of a school. How they got in, that is another discussion that's happening, and go to the library and pull off books that they feel are offensive, that shouldn't be. The level of arrogance. So to me, the level of our comfort, our continued comfort, with not having to have an agenda or a time limit to define who we are, is a message I hope can be talked about. I think PFLAG does an incredible job. When you're 18, whatever, I feel that Ben Marion quietly has engaged in groups where we're asked to come to talk about this very issue. America as a whole, we want to blame it on Queen Victoria? Hell no. She knew what she was doing. I mean, we are stuffy society, and when it comes to sex, I mean, it's like whatever. We do not yet have come of age totally in our sexuality as a country. When I was in Amsterdam, my friends would say, "Oh, Abby, let me give you a hug." It's like we're looked upon as so provincial, but also so unknowing of how to be comfortable with ourselves. That's the key. So what could be more delicious than the gay community beginning to talk about being comfortable with ourselves, and we're going to show you how to be comfortable with yourself. And when I say gay community, I mean, like this t-shirt's with everybody, black, white, I don't care, what mix. I grew up in a home that truly understood and talked about this behind whatever doors, that as Jews go, blacks go. As blacks go, queers go. Now reverse it. As queers go, blacks go. As blacks go, Jews go. Never remembering that those blacks and Jews also have queers. But we need to look at that, and for somebody who's questioning their sexuality, I say it's one of the most beautiful journeys one can take, so don't get verklempt over it. Don't get verklempt, because we're in a society that don't impose, you know, unless someone else, you know, don't let someone else tie your shoelaces. You know how you like them tight.
You got one up here.
That is one up there.
Well, let me preface by saying, I have known Abby since I moved here in 1976. And what she has done before that, and then since, is why I always say she's a national treasure. I want you to applaud because it's true.